So, hey everyone, welcome to the scouting portion of the Open Hockey Conference. So today I'm very lucky to be joined by Byron Bader and Scott Wheeler. I'll let both of them introduce themselves, but I want to say these are two of the top people on, Hockey Prospects Twitter. And what's even more interesting is that they come from perhaps opposite side of the spectrum. Not completely opposite, but I think they both bring some very different technical qualifications to the party. So whoever wants to go first, maybe Byron.
Yeah, so I'm Byron Bader. So I created, and I'm the president or whatever of Hockey Prospecting, which is it's essentially a model and a bunch of tools to gauge prospects and their progression based on essentially their production sort of normalized by each league, and it goes back 30 years. So you can it's this big quantitative data set to basically be able to level all the players on the same playing field and look at different comparable players that look similar in terms of their production and their sort of movement through these different production levels. So so I've been doing that for about 3 or 4 years now, and that's me.
And I'm Scott Wheeler. I cover prospects nationally for The Athletic. There are kind of two parts to my job, if you will. One is the storytelling piece, which is getting to know these kids on a personal level, spending time with them, visiting with them, watching them play, that kind of a thing. And then while watching them play, there's the other piece, which is the evaluation and studying these kids from a more nuanced level and more of a third party level, where I try to divorce myself from what I know about them and study them from apples to apples, oranges to oranges, that kind of a thing. So very different than the work Byron does, although certainly I use your work in mine, and data is a big part of what I do as well, but certainly taking more of the sort of classic eye test to what I do.
And just to offer a reminder, so I worked in the Toronto Maple Leafs organization where I did a ton of work with prospects, whether at the amateur draft or after the draft and player development. So during that process, I've had a chance to scout prospects on video. I've had a chance to scout prospects in person. I've actually interviewed some of them in person at the pre-draft combine in Buffalo at 2019, where we did some pretty different things in terms of video analysis and, in terms of interviewing prospects and testing their hockey sense. So I'll mostly be moderating the conversation between both of you, but certainly, really excited to see where this goes. And the first topic that I like to introduce is the idea of scouting criteria. So scouting criteria is a very important idea before you start with, whether you're using eye tests or analytics or, what you value in players. Scouting criteria is simply the set of values through which you're valuing these prospects. So what you care about as a team or what you care about as a scout. And in Toronto, for instance, if I can boil it down to the simplest level, we wanted players who were good skaters, had good skills, had good hockey sense, and were good learners. So players who were going to be improving over time in our system. So we didn't care so much about size or where they came from or other things. And you can see how in recent years that's really influenced the types of picks that Toronto's made at the draft table. So Scott, let's start with you. So what are some of the key scouting criteria that you use in your process?
Well, I think that the two big things that I look for are a player's ability to do two things. The first is plan. I want to see a player's ability to anticipate the play, to understand where the play is going, whether that's a defender reading the play and anticipating where the puck is going to travel to, or whether that's a forward, either with or without the puck, understanding what to do with it and places to put it into. I think the big thing within the sort of planning piece of hockey is problem solving, right? I think there's this perception of hockey as this track meet and getting faster and faster and faster. And actually, I think oftentimes, especially inside the offensive zone, it's the opposite, right? The game slows down. And then when it slows down, it's how do you figure out what's in front of you and navigate your way either through it, around it, etc. So there's the planning part. And then the other part is, I think, the improvisation. Increasingly, players are being asked in traffic, under pressure, whether you're a defenseman on zone exits with little bump plays or a forward in tight inside the offensive zone, when the planning goes out the window and when you can't anticipate and when you can't be one step ahead of the play, it's how are you improvising? Can you escape pressure? Can you do things with the puck or away from the puck to get open in a split second? Can you react in that moment? So those are probably the two big things I look for when I'm watching a player. And those aren't just skills with the puck. Those are also all of the things that they're doing without the puck. And I think within that, maybe I almost devalue skating in today's game. I think if you have that sort of planning and improvisation piece, that suddenly your ability to move your feet really, really quickly doesn't have to be the be all and end all. It's still an important piece of what I do. But I think we can get carried away with that skating piece and with those elements that you really catch, how hard a player shoots the puck, how fast they move their feet, those things. I'm not terribly concerned, if I'm being honest, with those specific things when I'm watching a player.
That's super interesting because later on we're going to have 3 case studies that we'll talk through, and what you're saying really resonates with me for one of those 3 players, which we'll get to later. So Byron, maybe because your methods are so quantitative, basically I'm asking you to speak on behalf of your model. So what does your model value when it comes to prospects?
Yeah, so I mean, my look at it, like I'm not a scout or a traditional scout in any sense of the term. I'm more of a data scientist, analytics professional by trade. So my model is basically, it's all about probabilities and looking at the highest chances. And, like I said with the model, it goes back all the way to 1990. And what you find with the model is there's certain patterns that sort of emerge with players. So like, superstars that are drafted, in the top 5 and then make the NHL right away and turn into stars, they look a certain way. A superstar who kind of maybe comes out of nowhere and develops into something like a Johnny Gaudreau, they look a certain way. Guys that bust or guys that, everybody talks about, this guy's going to be the next star, and then they don't hit, they often look a certain way that doesn't, have a high probability of hitting in the sense of a star or becoming an NHLer. So that's kind of how I look at it. And, these patterns have existed for decades. I mean, you go back, the same patterns emerge, the game has kind of changed around them, but those patterns are still there. So that's what I'm kind of looking for. I'm looking for these kind of, they're almost like outliers, because the ones that show that true, star form, they're pretty rare. So when you see them pop up, you look at the data and these guys hit, 4 out of 5 times, they're going to turn into a star in the NHL. So I'm kind of looking at that first when I'm sort of, making my lists and assembling my rankings, how I do it. And a big component there is their age. Age is huge in the model. So, I mean, you could have guys that are hitting essentially in a similar equivalency. But if you have one guy who's kind of born in November of the previous year versus a guy who's doing the same thing of August of the next year, like that's a massive jump. I mean, that's, an 8-9 month difference, but in young hockey prospects, that's a huge difference. So I'm kind of looking at all from the probabilities, the types of players that tend to hit and the types of players that really tend to miss a lot of the time. 9 out of 10 times you see this guy doesn't even make the NHL. That's what I'm kind of watching for is this window of players that hit, and also those kind of age gaps and how they're going to progress through these different thresholds that I'm looking at.
And maybe just to tie both of your points together is, no matter if you're looking at kind of like the soft skills that Scott mentioned or the hard production that Byron's talking about, to be a good NHL GM or to have a successful team, you're looking for these outliers, these stars, these freaks of nature, right? Because you don't really go far with 22 decent players. You got to have 3 or 5 or maybe even 7 stars kind of leading the charge for you to have a sustainable contender. So, so really happy that we made good time on this first part, and that really leads us to our second part where we're gonna debate, or we're gonna look at 3 prospects that are going to be available at the draft, this coming draft. And what I'll do is I'll share my screen, because we'll actually start with Byron's model outputs. So 3 players that we're going to be looking at. The first one is Lane Hutson, who's an undersized, offensive-minded left shot defenseman. at the U.S. National Development Program. So Byron, because we're looking at your viz here, can you talk us through this?
Yeah, so like you said, he's kind of an undersized offensive defenseman. And when you look at him in the model, like, yeah, he has the offense. It kind of comes through in the model, but it's not one of these like outlier type offenses. When you look at, his projection right now is a 5% star probability, and that can grow, obviously, because I'm kind of watching him over a 5-year period. So that can grow, but it starts off at kind of 5% at the draft and then a 43% chance of making the NHL. And the thing with Hutson is there's a lot of D-men, and forwards that kind of have this mold. I call it an older prospect with sort of an above average equivalency. And there's probably 5 to 10 of these from each the defensive side and the forward side each year. So, now when you're dealing with a player like that, it's kind of sifting through, like, does he have that intangible to turn into a star, to be something special? When you look at these guys, he's not one of these outlier production unicorns that, 4 out of 5 times they turn into a massive star in the NHL. It's more like 1 out of 5 times or 1 out of 6 times a guy like this turns into a big star. So for me, especially because he's really small, he's 5'8" defenseman, like, he's just minuscule out there. He looks like a little kid when you watch him. Like, this is a massive unicorn. Like, normally, a D-man is at least 6 feet, often 6'2" to 6'4" type thing. So that's one thing about it. And my reservation with him would be there's probably a lot of players that show better in the model, earlier, that this isn't really a top 5 or a top 10 guy. Not that he would probably ever go that early because he's so small. But, as you kind of get into maybe the later first round, that's when, the probabilities start to stack up. Probably all like the really heavy hitter, really high star probability guys are gone. And that's when I would probably start to look at a guy like this, because, yeah, he does have a lot of flash and he's fun to watch, and, he's good on both sides of the puck. When you read the scouting reports, like, there's a lot of positives, but yeah, he'd be a guy that I'd be kind of looking at from, 20, 25 on type thing.
So Scott, now before we go to you, let me pull up some clips, because I think a lot of what he does are better illustrated through video. So
Yes.
So I'll just let these play. So we're looking for 23, the lefty on the white team, and then Scott, you can tell us what you like about this player.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, so I mean, the big thing with Lane, first of all, is the skating ability, and it doesn't. I mean, these are offensive sequences that we're seeing here, where he's stepping off the line and he's being active and he's keeping his feet moving, and it's that sort of lateral agility through his edge work and all of that, and that is all super, super high end in Lane's game. But the thing that actually really, really stands out to me is the way that he defends. I think there's this perception of these smaller players that when he's 5'8", and as he told me very excitedly, 150 pounds now, when I went to see him 2 weekends ago at the program in Plymouth, there's this perception that they're going to struggle in board battles, they're going to struggle along the wall, all of those sort of ideas that are built into our minds about what NHL defensemen look like. And if you talk to Adam Nightingale, their coach there, or if you watch this kid play on a nightly basis, his ability defensively is as impressive as the things he can do with his feet around the offensive zone. So he plays those sort of airtight gaps. His stick is always being disruptive. He strips a ton of pucks. And then even along the wall or in those sort of dirty areas of the ice, he's a kid who comes away with a lot of pucks because of his feet and because of how smart he is with his stick and pulling pucks out of feet and changing directions and stopping and starting inside the defensive zone. So that's the big thing for me with Lane, is not just the offensive piece, but okay, can he defend at the next level? And with the way that he defends, at least again against his peers, it's going to get a lot more difficult for him when he starts playing tougher competition. With the way he defends against his peers, I do see a lot of qualities there that they feel like they might work. They feel like, okay, if you take this guy in the second or third round, or even sort of flyer in the late first, maybe there's something that you can work with, something that your development team can get their hands on. You give him time in college, you give him time to sort of manifest the rest of his abilities. He's never going to be pushing people around, but if he can be disruptive enough defensively, and I like the gap that he just closed there with his feet, then suddenly you've got something. If he's still forcing in dumps like a bigger, longer defenseman is, if he's still closing out on you and making it hard on you to get to the inside, and he can do that consistently, that's a big deal regardless of how big you are. And you kind of mentioned that with the Leafs and their approach is that they don't really care about the size piece of the puzzle. And certainly it does matter at a certain point. You're going to be facing someone who's bigger and stronger than you. But with how tight he is and how intelligent he is, it just feels like it might work. And there comes a point in the draft where every kid that's left, as Byron kind of touched on, every kid that's left has question marks. So then it's about quantifying and trying to subjectively decide, okay, which question marks are we going to gamble on and what are the pieces of the puzzle that we think we can use? And Lane just strikes me as one of those rare exceptions to the rule, as a kid who might just have enough there on both sides of the puck and between the ears to be able to continue to figure it out at the next level.
Okay, well, certainly I think none of us really know the answer right now, because if we did, we'd be killing it in the scouting room. But let's move on to someone who's while a defenseman is completely different. So we've gone from an undersized left-handed D who plays, we would qualify as a weaker league, right? Because first of all, the NTDP has a lot of good players every year, but also they play the USHL, which is a better, one of the better junior leagues, but it's not one of the better feeder leagues necessarily that we'll find at the draft. So now we're going to look at a player by the name of Simon Nemec, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly.
Yep, I think that's right. I've listened to the clips 1,000 times to try and get it right, and that sounds about
Simon
right.
Nemec.
So.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this player he's 6'1". He's a right-handed D, and I say that because there is a premium that teams will pay for a righty, and he plays in a pro league in Europe, and he plays in the Slovak league, which is a lesser known league, but as Byron's research has shown, is surprisingly strong. Not many prospects come out of there directly from their draft year, but we're going to look at Nemec's sorry here. Let us look at Nemec's. Oops.
Just while you're pulling it up, just to go back to Hutson, the cool thing about Hutson and this period of time, like all the great stuff that Scott mentioned, is, you know, if you go back 10, 15, 20 years ago, like, because he's so small, no matter what he would have done, like, that's like a 5th, 6th, 7th round pick. Like, he would never get drafted earlier. But now you're seeing forwards and defensemen, shorter guys, being drafted higher and higher, like they should be, because, you know, there's a lot of talent there. So, you know, he kind of has the era on his side, I guess, that he's probably going to get a decent shot and he's going to get drafted, you know, in the probably top 4 rounds type thing. So kind of an interesting period to be a short defenseman like that. Like, at least he's going to get a shot anyways. So
I would add there, and I would have to look at the numbers on this. This is mostly just anecdotally. I do think that the game is still, especially scouting and drafting and developing these players, still lagging behind more on smaller defensemen than on smaller forwards.
Oh yeah, for sure.
You can count on one hand the number of 5'9", 5'8" defensemen playing in the NHL this season, right? So whereas the number is much larger for forwards, and I think that's reflected in the draft, and maybe that's for good reason. But even as the game has changed, players like Lane still remain sort of 1 in a million kind of thing. That these kids just aren't coming along and making it past junior.
Yep.
All right. So I've been able to pull up Nemec's viz, and now we've gone from like a good value pick or a player who's starting to become more popular at least his archetype is, but we've gone from kind of that value pick to almost a no-brainer. So Byron, let's hear about Simon Nemec.
Yeah, so Nemec, like, he's one of my favorite prospects probably in the entire model, because he's so unique and he has this outlier profile that I'm sort of looking for. So obviously he's got the production, you know, he's I think like a 0.5 point per game type thing in the Slovak league. And, you know, for reference, like, the Slovak league is really good. Like it's pretty much on par with the Czech league. Not a lot of players, especially this young, come out of it. You know, you have like Marian Hossa and I think Marian Gabrick are like the high profile guys that came out of this league. So, I mean, it doesn't happen very often. So when you see it, you know, it's pretty rare. Yeah, so he's got the production and that equivalency of 31 from a D-man from a legit pro Euro league, that's only happened essentially 3 times now, basically in history, going back as far as the model does anyways. And basically the only players that have done that in their draft year are Hedman, Dahlin, and Brandt Clark last year in his short sample. So he's got that going for him. So, I mean, all these guys look great, and, you know, the earlier 2 are already stars in the NHL. But the really rare thing that he has is he was playing in that same Slovak league the year before in his pre-draft year, and the production was there, which is basically like unheard of territory. Like normally a D-man, especially if they're playing in the pro league in their pre-draft year, they're getting no ice time and they have no production, like literally whatsoever. And then they'll probably bounce back and forth with, you know, the junior leagues by each country. Whereas he was there, you know, it was a small sample. It was probably COVID related. That's probably why he got a shot. But he was there and he was producing at like a really good rate. So, I mean, yeah, I love this guy. Like the players that look like this, you can see the comps there. There's not a lot that look like this. Like you can probably count them on a hand or two, the players that, you know, have this high of an equivalency this early in their career. So yeah, I'm all over this guy as a top 5 pick, probably even a top 3 pick, maybe even a top 2 pick. I really like him. And, you know, when you watch him play, like I've heard a couple people on Twitter and stuff, different scouts and whatnot, they kind of say he reminds them of Adam Fox, like the way he makes those passes that nobody else in the building can kind of see, and sets things up. And yeah, I think he's going to be great. And I would for sure take him certainly in the top 5.
Oh, Scott, what do you got on him?
Well, the big thing for me is that I think the intelligence piece and the Adam Fox comp, and you don't have to throw those out because it puts lofty expectations on a kid like this. But that's what I see is that when we go back to that sort of planning piece of the puzzle, and I think Scott Perunovich does an incredible job of this and will in St. Louis shortly as well. But the sort of planning, the being 2 seconds ahead of the play, whether that's understanding routes, understanding where to be positionally, defensively, or just seeing the ice at a very, very high level. And then the other big thing, which people often come back to with Simon, is his skating as well, a lot like Lane. He's drawn comparables to kind of Jamie Drysdale for how light he is on his edges. And I would say that Jamie's actually a much lighter. Jamie almost floats on the ice out there, whereas Semic has a little bit more of a heaviness, a little bit more of a sturdiness on his feet than Jamie did, certainly at the same age. Jamie has gotten a little bit stronger, but no, Simon's, I mean, he's a heck of a player. One of those kids who just sort of understands the game. He doesn't take, actually, despite how productive he's been in that league, he's not a huge risk taker. He's not a kid who's going to put himself and compromise himself and put himself out of positioning. And part of that is because he's playing big minutes there. He has been playing for the last 2 seasons, pretty significant minutes there, and has obviously played in Olympic qualifying for them and played on the men's team. The one thing that I thought Byron said there that was actually really interesting as we watch these clips here is the fact that it's actually almost an equivalent league to the Czech league, because I've watched a lot of this league, obviously, the last 2 years. And just anecdotally, I wouldn't have said that at all, just by the sort of quality of the hockey, how sloppy the hockey can be there, how difficult I found it to evaluate Brandt Clark last year. But it's interesting that the data doesn't necessarily reflect that. And that may speak to really how good Simon is, and maybe a little bit more credit that he's owed. Because I think that oftentimes the knock on him as not being a top 5 guy, and I absolutely agree with you there. He's been 3rd on my board for my first 2 draft rankings here. But the knock on Nemec has kind of been the league. And can you comfortably take a kid as good as he looks? Can you take that kind of a kid 2nd or 3rd overall when there's just so much uncertainty and so few case studies that have come through the league? So the fact that you're saying that the data actually reflects it as being stronger than maybe I might have thought it would be is really interesting to me.
Yeah, so I actually have some opinions on what we just talked about, because Byron, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of the analysis or the data set that you're using, it obviously, any data that we use is backwards looking data, right? So if this league, let's say, has gotten significantly weaker or even a little bit weaker in the past, let's say 3 to 5 years, the model is going to be a little bit late telling us that, because obviously the model is only looking backwards. So that's, I think, perhaps something's changed, because I know that in terms of development or in terms of their domestic leagues, the Czechs and the Slovaks have had a lot of issues kind of maintain that quality of play or retaining good players. And this is why we don't see a lot of players coming directly out of the domestic leagues anymore. That's one thing. But the other thing is, in Nemec's favor, is that I just find players who make pro league sooner and play against men and with men and are coached by, pro level coaches, you got to do a bunch of little things to earn your ice time or just to get yourself out there. Whether it's, like simple as like showing up to team meetings on time, because otherwise you get benched, right? If you're like big dog on campus at the program and maybe, the details aren't being taken care of, who knows? You might still play. But certainly if you're a 16-year-old showing up to a pro video meeting late, like for sure you're sitting the next game, right? Like the team is not depending on you. Or even like I'm looking at Nemec's clips and I see a lot of sloppiness, but just the fact that he's able to earn those minutes and give himself opportunities despite the sloppiness of the hockey or even some of his own mistakes. Like I see him giving up 2-on-1s or being over aggressive at time, or just it's not egregious, but as a 17, 18-year-old, like you anticipate him to get better at this. Whereas if I contrast to Hutson a few moments ago, like he's playing a very strong team. They're pretty well coached. All of his teammates know how to play with him, so it looks really good. Like he's in the ozone all the time. Yeah. So really interesting kind of dichotomy there.
And I wonder, I mean, you mentioned off the top there the catching up. I wonder if it will actually catch up and go the reverse direction after how many kids went over there last year. Like when the data catches up to all of those 03s who were playing in the league last season and 02s who were playing in the league last season, and it having 20 NHL prospects instead of one NHL prospect, maybe the league will start to look glossier. And what kind of effect might that have on the other side as an outlier season that could sort of unduly influence or give the Slovak league a glossier perception moving forward within the model?
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's one of those things where, like I said, like the sample is super small for these leagues. So you're kind of, it's based on data, but it's kind of like an educated guess, like on faith, because the sample's so small. Whereas when you're dealing with like the WHL and the OHL, like the sample is massive. Like there's not much movement there that there's going to be much play. But yeah, exactly that type of thing with the 2021 season with those guys jumping over, and they're, Brant Clark, he was the notable one that really stood out. But I mean, I'd have to go back to the data. I think Tulio, like he was up there for a bit. I think he had some pretty notable numbers, but nothing crazy. Like I haven't seen anything bonkers where it's a guy with a super low probability that jumped over there and then he has these insane numbers. It kind of looks like the natural progression in terms of their equivalency, what's come back so far. So yeah, it'll be for sure interesting to look back and, 3 to 5 years once the kind of data sets in and you can see what the players are and see what that season specifically kind of looks like. So
yeah.
Okay, so how about this? I'm gonna call an audible. Let's take like a 2-minute break. I'll cut this conversation. I'll save the recording, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about last but not least Shane Wright. How about that?
Sounds good.
All right.
Cool.
Okay, well, welcome back, Byron and Scott. So we really wanted to leave enough time for this conversation, which is what is going on with Shane Wright.
I can start here. Well, I think first of all, there are two pieces to the Shane Wright conversation that are fascinating to me. There's the desire, I think, for a lot of people to hang on tight to his original sort of 15-year-old season and how spectacular it was. I think there's this assumption that, hey, here's this kid who lost a year, but he still had this huge season. And in time, he's going to play catch up and all will be well with Shane Wright. And I think the reality, and I'm sure you could touch on this too, Jack, but I think the reality is that sometimes there is no catching up. Sometimes this is just the new kid. And from here forward, you're working with a different baseline because he did lose that year. And then on the flip side, he's got 11 points in his last 5 games, and suddenly he's starting to look like the Shane Wright of that first season again, and had another 3 points today before we recorded this. So I think there's this, at least publicly in terms of the discussion that's happening, and it's happening privately with scouts as well. There's this give and take of this idea of Shane Wright and who he was and what we were projecting him to be 2 years ago. And then there's this pull the other way of scouts who are suddenly watching him play this season and impressed, but not wowed. And then how do you juxtapose being very happy with what you're seeing, but not this kid is the clear-cut first overall pick, this kid's a future superstar kind of thing. And then the third piece, if there is one, is the defensive piece of the puzzle. And how do we evaluate defensive forwards? And everything we know about Shane Wright, everything that anybody who has coached or played with Shane Wright will tell you is that Shane Wright is a heck of a two-way player, that he can be counted upon defensively. He sacrifices some of his offense to provide that defensive pressure. You'll see him below the goal line in his own zone a lot. You'll see him trailing behind the play up ice a lot because he's constantly supporting the puck. And a lot of players his age don't do those things, and they cheat for the offense. And other scouts will tell you that he could have cheated for his offense when it wasn't maybe coming like he wanted it to early in this year, but he stuck with his guns and stuck with how he played. And now suddenly he's starting to turn the corner again. So it's not a conversation that's over. And I think it'll be a fascinating conversation for the rest of the season here. But I do think there's this give and take of the idea of what Shane Wright was through minor hockey and into his first season in the OHL. And then this lost season, and assuming that he's going to just get back to where he was and that the lost season isn't maybe as big of a factor as it has become for him.
So Byron, what do you got? So I do you see the viz on the screen right now?
I do, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Scott's saying. I mean, it's like unheard of territory. I mean, what he was doing in his D-2 year when he sort of got this exceptional status, like what his equivalency then I think was about 28 or 29, which, I mean, that early in your career, that's outpacing, Crosby, McDavid, Matthews, all these type of generational guys. He was kind of ahead of it. That's why, people started to get really excited about him, started talking about a generational talent, and then, his D-1 year gets completely wiped out, which is unheard of to begin with. But normally, if that does happen, or you lose 80% of the season, it's because of injury, right? Like this is wiped out he's not injured. He's just sitting there waiting to play. So, I mean, losing that season, like there's no frame of reference to say, oh, this is what happened to this guy when it happened to him and a pandemic hit and he lost his whole season. You've never seen this before. So losing that is big. And then now he's not quite where you'd expect essentially a generational talent. So, if you look back at these generational guys like Crosby, Matthews, Patrick Kane, I'd put in that category, McDavid, obviously, they have a really, really extraordinary equivalency in their pre-draft year. So that's wiped out. We can't see what that was, but it looked like he was trending to something pretty substantial. And then normally by their draft year, they have like an equivalency of 50 or greater, which is, I mean, it almost never happens, only basically for these generational type guys. And right now he's at that 32, which, I mean, it's still good. You look at his comps, you look at what he looks like, he's still got a star potential of 45% NHLer at 71%. The comps, they're good. Schwartz, Skinner, Leclerc, Nash, Friesen, all really good NHLers, some stars in there. But like his comps should be, Crosby, Matthews, Jack Hughes is in that mix as well, but he's not. But, like Scott mentioned, the offense is starting to come now. now he's really starting to produce, and I think he's going to get up there. Maybe he doesn't quite get up to that kind of 50 equivalency I'm looking for, but I bet he hits the 40s, and I bet he looks, very much the part that he's first overall pick, and he's going to be a heck of a player. And like Scott mentions, like my model's not very good at picking up the defensive side, but everything you hear about Shane Wright is how good he is defensively as well. So, I mean, there's not really too many concerns here. I mean, maybe you don't get like an over a point per game guy like a Crosby or a McDavid, but maybe maybe you get a 60, 70 point guy who's really, really good defensively, which is not the worst thing either. So, I mean, he's probably still a first overall pick, certainly for me, and I'm pretty certain he's going to get picked there as well. So, yeah, really interesting case though. You'll probably never see it again.
I did love the decision to attack off the wall in the neutral zone immediately when he touched the puck on that very first sequence you showed there, Jack. And that's part of it too, is he goes to the inside of the ice. He does all of those things that coaches rave about. And he's also got the goals haven't fallen at this sort of 18-20% shooting percentage that we can often see in these top picks in their draft year. He's shooting closer to sort of 11-12%, which for an NHLer is great, but for the best player in junior hockey is not. But his shot should start to click, I think, closer to that sort of 18-20% that we often see among top junior players, because it really does pop off of his stick. And I mean, on that clip without almost any drawback. So that arsenal offensively, we always talk about the defensive piece with Shane Wright, but that is definitely a weapon for him offensively.
So then I think the conversation here is more about how Wright can get better and what he needs to get better at, right? Because we know that he's probably going to play in the NHL for a long time and with good outcomes. But what is it that you're looking? Because if you're getting a first overall pick, then you expect this player to be, the be all and end all. But what are some things that Wright can still work on?
Well, I think the skating is one of them. He's got this really wide gate to his stance. If you watch him skate, kind of that Sidney Crosby low center of gravity, wide base to his stride. And on one hand, that's a good thing in board battles. It's a good thing when he's taking bumps and he's getting hit in the middle of the ice to play through contact and play through the wall and that kind of a thing. But it doesn't help him adjust extremely well. He's not a very agile sort of east-west creator. So it does tend to break down into sort of straight line paths. He's attacking the center of the ice. He's looking for his shot. So I wouldn't say he's a super, super slick skater. He could probably sort of add an element or add a little bit of a quality there that allows him to take cuts and crossovers a little bit better than he does, rather than just sort of powering his way and pushing his way up the ice. And then the other thing is, despite the sort of boxy shoulders, I mean, if you run into this kid in real life, he looks like an athlete. He's looked like an athlete since he was 15 years old in Don Mills. He 14 years old in Don Mills, I should say. So he has that sort of hockey player look to him. But I don't think beyond that, there's a ton of creativity or that sort of creative flair to his game either that you often expect out of these sort of highly dynamic offensive players. So I think that's the big thing, is the sort of playmaking creative element and the skating. And obviously those are two very important pieces. And I don't think either of those things are poor. I'm not here to say that Shane Wright's a bad skater. He's actually a very compact, powerful, athletic kid, a very, very athletic kid. But again, the east to west on both of those fronts, both the creativity piece and the skating piece, I think if he gets his east to west game improved, that'll make a big difference for opening up his options offensively.
Okay, well, that's been a really great discussion on scouting in general, and thank you so much for participating. And I'm sure a lot of people will find value in this conversation. So plug what you're working on, where people can find you.
My work is all found at The Athletic, which is obviously a subscription service. So we know that's a hard sell, but we've got an incredible team, and it's as simple as that. So check out The Athletic, and that's about it for me as far as sales jobs go.
Yeah, my website is hockeyprospecting.com. It's just me, just one-man shop. And so, yeah, it's also a subscription-based approach. So it's, $25 a year, and you get access to all the tools, like I said, going back 30 years. So you can kind of go through and compare these players and get lost down the rabbit holes of previous drafts. And yeah, my Twitter handle is Byron M. Bader, and I'll post different stuff about players and unique facts about them and stuff. So feel free to follow me there and ask me any questions.
And then before we sign off, what's one thing about scouting you want to learn this year? What's one thing that one question you're hoping to get answered?
How to scout. Just like what to watch for and what scouts look at and what they see as, this guy is going to be the next player. What are they, I've heard it. I've chatted with teams and stuff and kind of been around it a little bit, but I would love to get more into it to just find out, what they're seeing with their eyes that says, oh yeah, this guy's going to be the next player, and then kind of joining that with the model and seeing where I might be missing or where they might be missing something, that type of stuff. But getting more into that and just finding out what makes them pop and what they're seeing as the next sort of superstar, I guess, and what they're looking for.
And the big thing I'm working on in terms of my process these days is this challenge that I've found myself in on a few players of catching up to who they're becoming sort of in the second half of their season, maybe a little bit too late. I think I watch a player a few times early on in a year or in previous years, and I come to this general sense of who they are. And I think that has inhibited me when kids have really taken off, as we know that they can at 17, 18 years old. And it's burned me. I was too late to get on the Moritz Seider train when Moritz was doing what he did in Germany in his draft year and into the World Championships that year. And Jake Sanderson, same thing. Really, we talked about birthdays earlier. He was a late summer birthday who was brilliant in the second half. And I think just watching him in the first half of that season, my understanding of who he was as a player was anchored in those early viewings. So I'm trying to enter repeat viewings this year, and I've made a conscious effort to this of entering repeat viewings almost with a clean slate of what I think a player is, and not sort of entering it with some preconceived notion of how I think they're going to play or how I think they're going to look. So that's probably the big way I've tried to check myself, and I'm trying to learn this year.
All right. Well, awesome insights. Thank you both for being part of this, and looking forward to learning more from you in the future.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. And thanks for putting this on. The free hockey conference is a great idea.
Yeah. All right. Well, take care. See you soon.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers, guys.